Blog Talk Radio.
I'd like to welcome all of you to Ohio Exopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snyder, and we are broadcasting live from the beautiful Dillon State Park here in East Central Ohio. I'd like to remind all of you to please press the follow button if you haven't done so already, and you'll be notified 1 hour prior to the start of each Ohio Exopolitics. The music you hear at the beginning and end of each show is performed by your host, and CDs are available on request. Our guest this evening is John Lear. He is a retired airline captain and a former CIA contract pilot with over 19,000 hours of flight time, over 11,000 in command of 3 and 4 engine jet transports, and has flown over 100 different types of aircraft in 60 different countries around the world. He is the son of the Lear jet inventor Bill Lear, and John holds more FAA airman certificates than any other FAA certified airman. I'm going to have to play a little music and try to get in touch with... Oh, there he is. I believe this is John now. Hello, John. How are you this evening?
Hey, great. How you doing?
Hey, John. I'm glad you called in there. We were running a little late, I think, and I'm glad we got all of our I's dotted and T's crossed there. Anyway, welcome to the show. How's the weather in Las Vegas this evening?
Oh, the winter swept in about 2 or 3 days ago, and I got up in the morning to let the dog out, and the chill blasted through me, and I looked at the thermometer, which is right on the wall next to the kitchen, and it said 75, and I ran right up and got my gloves and scarf and watch cap, and got my long undies out and prepared for the cold.
Have you ever lived in a cold climate?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're well aware.
I've been in a cold climate. I'll tell you, the coldest I was ever in my life is when I was 18 years old. I was going to, for some reason, I decided to hitchhike from Geneva, Switzerland to Copenhagen, Denmark. And that's not the time you should be hitchhiking, but I did anyway. And after 4 or 5 days, I hooked up with a Hungarian, and we ended up in a place in northern Germany called Kolding. And it was late at night. We didn't have any place to sleep. There was no hotels. We didn't have any money anyway. So there's things like youth hostels where you can stay in the summer, and for a couple of francs or a couple of marks like that. But it wasn't open. So we banged on the door of this guy, and he said, well, I can open it. You can stay tonight, but I can't turn the heat on. And so we said, okay. So that was the coldest I ever spent that night. It had to be well below 32 the whole night, but we made it.
What were you doing in Switzerland and Germany?
I lived there. My father moved there in 1955 to sell Lear autopilots and radio equipment to foreign airlines, and also that's where he initially started the development of the Learjet. And he was under the impression that Switzerland had a lot of technical ability and also raw materials, source of raw materials, and it could be done much cheaper than in the United States. But in 1962, he gave up for the reasons that the Swiss just aren't in a hurry like Americans are, and he moved to Wichita, Kansas, and started building the Learjet there. And this is when I was growing up, 1955. I was starting high school, actually junior high, and I was going back and forth. Somehow I got out of sync with my family, and when they lived in Switzerland, I was living in Pacific Palisades, California, and then when they moved back, I moved to Geneva. And so it was back and forth till about 1962 when I went to work for my dad in Wichita, Kansas, and lived there for a year, and then moved out to California.
Wow, so you were overseas when you were in your teens, and you weren't even with your parents?
No.
That's pretty gutsy.
Oh, it was pretty nice. I lived by myself when I was going to high school, 11th and 12th grade, and I worked at an old freight salvage depot that sold freight salvage, and I made a buck. That was when minimum wage was $1, and when I was working there is when it went to $1.15, or I think it was $1.25. And I saved up, and I got my first 1929 Model A Sport Coupe. It was in non-running condition, and I fixed it up so it would run, and that's what I drove back and forth from where I lived to high school. And it was the best car I ever had.
Really? That's cool. Well, we better shift gears and get back on topic here. I had to ask a few questions.
Sounds good to me.
Anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about Bob Lazar, which is kind of an interesting UFO story, and I want to play this older newscast that kind of introduces the whole Bob Lazar story, I think, in an interesting way, and then I'll ask you a question or two about that.
Too many people live out here in the remote sections of the Nevada desert far from the lights of Las Vegas. But here, on the edge of the secret U.S. government test facilities, people have been seeing strange things for years. Some of them talk about it, a lot of them don't. But no one who has actually worked on the test site has ever talked about what goes on there. No one, that is, until now.
They are actively and have in their possession alien spacecraft, and they are actively undergoing analysis.
And flying them.
And flying them.
Bob Lazar is an engineer and physicist who says he worked on flying saucers for the U.S. government at Area 51. He drew these sketches of one of 9 different saucers he says the government has in a secret warehouse. Lazar gave the saucers each names according to their various shapes. Top Hat, the Sport Model, the Jello Mold. Called in to help figure out how they work, Lazar says the saucers are powered by an antimatter generator, fueled with an element which he says could only have come from another planet.
They set up and produce their own gravitational field. Just as the Earth holds all matter down, they produce that same field, but out of phase, and it repels itself. The effects that can cause the way in which everything operates is by all intents and purposes, magic. I mean, it is so far beyond our level of technology.
Now, before you toss Lazar on the pile with all the other UFO wackos, understand that he willingly agreed to take a lie detector test, requested and independently arranged by a Las Vegas reporter. Terry Tavernetti is the ex-cop who administered the test.
If he's lying, he ought to be in Hollywood.
Anyway, Bob talked about different models of these spacecraft, and they were all set up to produce their own gravitational fields. Is that correct, John?
Right. That's correct, and the way they did it was by accessing the gravity A wave. Mainstream science doesn't know or hasn't let us know yet, but there are two forms of gravity, gravity A and gravity B. Gravity A works on an atomic scale and is what holds atoms together, and the gravity B works on a larger scale, a macro scale, and it's what holds planets in orbit around the sun and holds us on the Earth, and the Earth in orbit around the sun, the Moon in orbit around the Earth. But what they're able to do is by accessing this, what is now called the strong nuclear force, is actually gravity A, and what they're able to do is access this gravity wave, and they can generate a gravity field, and they can actually pull space towards them. Now, we think of space as a nothing, as a just cold nothing, but actually it holds it's one molecule of helium per square meter, and it's actually a fabric that you can pull towards you by exercising a strong gravitational pull. And what they do is they pull space towards the craft. Say they'll pick a space, they have 3 amplifiers, and they focus these amplifiers, say, maybe 100,000 miles out. And they pull it towards them, and it wraps around the craft. And then they turn the generator off, and then they fuse or coalesce or unite with that portion of space that they drew towards them. And they can do this. The gravity generator recycles every 12 milliseconds. So you can see that if they could travel 100,000 miles every 12 milliseconds, that they can cover a lot of distance at a great speed. And that's not one molecule of hydrogen. It's one molecule of hydrogen per square meter.
That is very interesting, John, and I want to go back over that in a little more detail in a second. I wanted to get back to the fact that Bob Lazar had passed a lie detector test, and I want to talk about that a little bit. Listen to this clip.
If he's lying, he ought to be in Hollywood, because he gave absolutely no physiological indications of attempted deception.
Lazar says he was referred to his government job by Dr. Edward Teller, the renowned scientist who helped develop the atomic bomb. But in a rare interview with Inside Report, Teller insisted he doesn't know Lazar, or at least doesn't remember him.
I think it appears that someone's trying to wipe him out.
George Knapp is the Las Vegas TV reporter who first aired Bob Lazar's amazing claims. He says he ran into unusual problems just trying to look into Lazar's background. Though Lazar claimed to have once worked at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, government officials denied they knew anything about him. But when Knapp came up with a phone directory listing Lazar's name, Los Alamos grudgingly admitted he had spent some time there. Officials at the hospital where Lazar was born even denied the simple fact he was born there.
John, did you know that Bob Lazar had passed a lie detector test? I didn't know that.
Yeah, they gave him 3 lie detector tests.
3?
3. They wanted to prove that.
Go ahead.
Can I tell you what?
Well, tell us more about it.
They were all given by Tabernetti.
Who? Tabernetti?
That's the guy who gave the. He's the Los Angeles police officer that gave the lie detector test.
I see. You know, I find it really strange that some of the people that are the most quote-unquote well-known and respected UFO investigators talk down Bob Lazar and Billy Meyer, who have both passed lie detector tests. And sometimes I think some of these well-known UFO investigators might be kind of government gatekeepers to steer the public away from certain UFO cases. What do you think about that?
Certainly, and we know that Stan Friedman is one of the biggest naysayers, and he'll eventually have to account for his actions.
I didn't want to say any names, but anyway, Bob Lazar, he was a physicist, and he worked at Los Alamos, the Mason Physics Facility in the early 1980s, and I think Bob had degrees in electronics and physics, and he also worked at S4 between 88 and 89, and the S4 facility, I think, is like 15 miles south of Area 51 at the Ellis Air Force Base. John, can you tell us how you first met Bob and kind of give us some more details about his background?
Sure. I had given a lecture here in Las Vegas at the Spring Valley Library in the spring of 1988, and I didn't realize how interested society was in UFOs. And when I walked into the library to give this lecture, I peeked. I was supposed to give it at 7, and I got there about 6:45 to set up my stuff, and I peeked in the door, and it was jam-packed, and there was a guy at the door, and I said, "What are all those guys doing in there?" And he said, "Waiting for you." Wow. And they had 1,200 people there, but they could only take 600. So I talked one night, and then the library asked if I'd talk another night. And anyway, it got to be a big deal, and my phone was ringing off the hook, and my wife just really didn't like it. She shut off or changed my telephone number, hid all my files, and was really pissed at the whole thing. So in the summer, a guy called me, a guy named Jimhoff. He called me and said, "Say, I'm really interested in what you got to say about UFOs, and I'd like to come over and either buy or have you give me some of the information." And I said, "Gene, I've been out of it, and I got to get out of it because my wife is all pissed off, and I just not doing it anymore." He says, "Well, okay." He says, "Listen, if you ever decide to get into it again, or you can give me that stuff, I'm a real estate appraiser, and I'll trade you an appraisal for it." And it just happened to be then that I was pretty broke. And I said, "Now, wait a minute, you're an appraiser?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, I just happen to need an appraisal because I'm going to get a second mortgage on my house." And I said, "So come on over and I'll get this stuff together for you, and you can have it in return for this appraisal." So he said, "Okay." So he showed up the day to do the measuring. And this is the first time I met him, and he brought a guy to help him hold the measuring tape, and the guy was Bob Lazar. And so Gene and I got talking about UFOs, and this guy Bob Lazar kept rolling his eyes and making funny noises and everything, and he made it obviously clear that he didn't believe in it. And so we asked him why, and he said, "Well, I worked at Los Alamos." He said, "I had a Q clearance, which is civilian top secret," and he said, "If there'd have been anything like that, I would have known about it. So don't give me this UFO BS because it's not true." Well, anyway, to make a long story short, over the next 3 or 4 months, we gave him enough information that piqued his interest to re-enter the scientific field. He wasn't working for Los Al at the time, and so he called Dr. Teller, who he knew, and told Dr. Teller that he wanted to re-enter the scientific field, and could he help him? And Dr. Teller said, "Do you want to work with me here in not Sunnydale, the other place, I can't remember, or do you want to work in Nevada?" And Bob said, "I want to work at Area 51." And Teller said, "Okay, well, let me make some phone calls." So over the next 6 weeks, Bob was called in for 3 interviews to EG&G, which was at then the head of the test site, although had nothing to do with UFOs. It's just that the U.S. Navy, who does, were using their offices. And he passed these three quizzes with flying colors. And so they hired him, and it was really interesting because I didn't know when he got his last interview, and the next thing I know is on December 6th, 1988, he shows up at my house in the evening, like he usually did, just to shoot the bull, and he says, "I saw a disc today." And I said, "What?" And he said, "I saw a disc today." And I said, "Theirs or ours?" And he said, "Theirs." And I said, "Oh, God, you went up to Groom Lake?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what are you doing here?" I said, "Why don't you work there for a while and then tell me, because you know they've got to obviously have followed you." And he said, "No." He said, "I will tell you why I'm doing this." He said, "I've seen you take so much static over the last year over this that I wanted to tell you, you're right. I saw it. I touched it. It's real. It's alien, and that's all there is to it." So that's how the Bob Lazar story started.
Wow, I didn't know you were into the whole UFO scene before you had met Bob. So you were giving lectures before you even met Bob Lazar.
Right.
That's interesting. So what first got you interested if it wasn't the Bob Lazar story?
What got me interested is I had not given it not too much thought, because in the 70s and early 80s I was really interested in secret airplanes, Blackbird, U-2, the YF-12A, SR-71, F-117A, F-19, all those airplanes. And a friend of mine who was the vice president of testers, John Andrews, was interested too, and we used to trade information. And at one point he wrote me a letter and he said, "What do you think about UFOs?" And I wrote him back. I said, "There's nothing to it. I looked into it." And I said, it's a waste of time. And he wrote me a letter back. He said, "Well, I think you ought to take another look at it, because I think it's true." And so starting in 1982, 83, I began to read some material and got pretty interested. And then in 1985, there was a reunion here in Las Vegas of Southeast Asia pilots. And one of the guys that I saw at the reunion was a Raven. Now, the Ravens were the Air Force people that they gave civilian ID to and worked in the secret war in Laos. And, of course, I worked for the CIA there, and I knew him there. And when he got out, he went back in the Air Force, flew with the Air Force Reserve, and flew A-10. So when I asked him what all he'd been doing, he said, "Well, I've been flying A-10s, and I was stationed at Bentwaters Air Force Base there near London for a couple of years." And I said, "Oh, Bentwaters." I said, "That's supposedly where the UFO landed, and General Gordon Williams saw it and filmed it." And he said, "No, not supposedly, John. It's true." He said, "I was confined to quarters, but I know the guys that saw it, and it's a true thing." So I couldn't believe it. I said, "You mean UFOs are real?" He said, "Yeah, they're real." And so the next thing that happened, almost in the same month, is I picked up Bud Hopkins' book, and Bud, of course, just passed away a few months ago. Really a great guy. And he wrote a book called Missing Time. And I read this book, and this book actually made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, because it was about abductions. And when I read it, I thought, man, this is real. I know this is real. I don't know how, but I do. And so with those two things, I really started checking in. In 1986, I took a trip. In those days we didn't have websites or anything, so everything had to be either by snail mail or word of mouth. And so I got in my truck and I drove around Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and California, interviewing people who were knowledgeable about UFOs. And 1980, the end of 86, early 87 is when I wrote the famous John Lear hypothesis about what I felt was going on. And, of course, that set off everything. And so I was on that roll, interest in UFOs, when I met Bob.
Well, that opens an interesting door. Can you tell us a little bit about the John Lear hypothesis?
Yeah, it's on the. All you have to do is look on the website, and basically it was and they made me, and I say they, my friends made me put hypothesis, even though I wanted to put this is real, this is going on. But it was a essay on the number of aliens I thought there were, that they were doing business with the government, that that they were doing the abductions. And in those days, I was falling for the story that the government put out that we were helping the aliens, that they were supposedly on the backside of an evolutionary curve, and they needed help to get their race going again, which is all, of course, BS. But I was buying it at the time. And I put this all in this essay, and all you have to do is go on the web and type John Lear hypothesis, and there'll be about 20,000 places to go to read it. But that was the hypothesis.
Well, that's fascinating. Is that hypothesis on thelivingmoon.com?
I don't think so, but it should be, and I'll call Ron Schmidt, who runs the Living Moon, and have him put it on. But it's no problem finding it. All you have to do is type in John Lear hypothesis, and it'll come right up.
Okay, I'll have to check that out. Bob Lazar describes the speed of light as 186,000 miles per second, which I think is about 669 million miles per hour. Let me play a little clip of John, or Bob, talking about the speed of light.
At the beginning of this first section, I'm going to give you 3 short science lessons, and once you've learned them, you'll not only know more about interstellar travel than almost anyone else in the world, but you'll know the actual method another civilization is used to travel from another star system to the planet Earth. Now, during the course of this, I'm going to have to relate information that I've learned at S4 to information that we're already aware of. And when I say we, I mean the general mainstream scientific community. So as not to waste too much time explaining established scientific facts and theories, when I say we know this or we know that, please feel free to consult any qualified scientist, professor, or science teacher to have them explain my statements to you. One of the most predominantly asked questions is, how is it possible to cross vast expanses of space without exceeding the speed of light? Or how can you travel in reasonable time and economy between points that are light years apart? Now keep in mind that the speed of light is 186,000 miles a second, which translates into roughly 669 million miles an hour.
I think I heard on Coast to Coast a physicist named John Brandenburg say that the only speed of light limit is according to Einstein's special relativity, but his general relativity theory says it's possible to warp space and that the speed of light is not a limit. And basically that's what you were describing before. Isn't that true, John?
That's correct. The aliens can travel hundreds of times the speed of light. It's not a limit.
And
in the special relativity, Einstein says light travels in a straight line. In general relativity, the light ray is bent. So in both cases, Einstein is they're both nonsense, as the whole special and general relativity is. It's complete nonsense.
Can you elaborate on that a little more?
Sure. The Einstein made up this. It's actually a mathematical exercise on relativity, and he goes on to say all the kinds of things that it can do, but most of them, all of them, are wrong. The general theory of relativity does not explain the rotation of the celestial bodies or the orientation of the axis of rotation of the planets. the orbital planes of all planets approximately on the solar equatorial plane. It does not explain the inclination of the plane to the orbit of each planet. It does not explain the direction of movement of the planets, which are counterclockwise as views from north. It does not explain the distance law or the eccentricities or the regression of the nodes or the precession of the equinoxes or the perturbations. That's to start. But the four main props that relativity are used to support relativity can all be knocked out with a feather. They can all be knocked down.
John, do you think that the powers that be have sent our science down a wrong path intentionally?
Absolutely, and they started. I've tracked it as far back as 1856, when a Danish mathematician gave a presentation at the observatory headquarters in Paris, and said that there might be life on the moon based on his calculations, and the Europeans bought that for about 15 years, but the head of the Navy, Admiral Newcomb, went over there in 1870, and based solely on his reputation, nothing about facts or anything like that, proceeded to destroy this guy, and it was never brought up again. But the Navy, who has been the head of the cover-up from the beginning, are the ones that are in charge of the cover-up, and they're the ones that put out all this disinformation, and are the ones that try to keep the theories of relativity going and all the experiments going. And every once in a while, you'll hear something say that some scientific news announcements say that they've again proven that the theory of relativity may be correct, but in fact it's not.
Gravity bends and distorts space, according to Bob Lazar, and even stars that are located behind the sun we can see because the gravity of the sun actually distorts space-time, and gravity can bend light. And I'm going to play this clip where Bob is explaining that little bit of information.
And one of its properties is that it can be distorted or bent by a gravitational field. We know that gravity bends or distorts space, time, and light by virtue of the fact that we're able to see stars which we know should be blocked from our view by the sun. Referring to the graphic here, the solid line denotes the position of a star that's located behind the sun, and the dotted line shows its position as viewed from Earth. This is made possible because the sun's gravitational field distorts the space, time, and light around the sun, allowing us to view stars which should be hidden from view.
John, can you elaborate a little more on how gravity actually can bend space and even light?
No, I'm going to pass on that. I don't think it does, but
really?
In getting my notes together tonight, I couldn't find exactly where it was written, so I'm going to pass on that question.
Fascinating. It's also said that time is distorted by gravity. And I've heard that if you take an atomic clock up to a high altitude and you take another one down to sea level, and then you let some time pass and you bring the two clocks together, that they'll actually have different times based on the fact that the one at the higher altitude was exposed to a weaker gravitational field. Do you think there's any truth to that, or can you comment on that at all?
No, but that's the same thing as your first question, and I couldn't find my notes on it, so I'm going to pass.
Okay. Understood. No problem. Basically, I guess what we're finding here is that these ships, when they bend space-time, that they're not really traveling in a linear fashion. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mm.
What they do is they pull a portion of space that they focus on towards the craft and wrap that space in a heart-shaped formation around the craft. And then when they turn off the gravity amplifiers, they unite or coalesce with that portion of space that they drew and put around the craft. So they don't travel in a linear direction. They unite or coalesce with that portion of space.
Well, John, do you mind if we take about a 2-minute break and we can refresh our drinks and go to the restroom and then pick back up where we left off?
Sounds good.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you back to Ohio Exopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snyder. We are speaking with John Lear. One of the websites he contributes a lot to is called thelivingmoon.com. You can check that out if you're interested in learning a little bit more about some of the topics we're talking tonight. We're talking about the Bob Lazar case. And
hey, also, I'd like to give a shout-out to Godlike Productions. I do a lot of posting on there, too.
Great, Godlike Productions. That's cool. And we're talking a little bit about Bob Lazar tonight and some of the interesting stuff that he's talked about. We were talking about the gravity A wave and the gravity B wave, and I think the gravity A wave is our micro scale, and the gravity B wave is the larger macro scale, and the gravity A wave is the power that holds the molecules together, and the gravity B is the kind of gravity that keeps planets orbiting their suns.
Right.
Is that true, John?
That's correct.
And Bob talks about this element 115. Can you elaborate on that at all?
Yeah, 115 is actually the fuel that enables them to travel these tremendous speeds and helps generate the power for the craft. And we've been able to synthesize up to 106, 107, 108. Germans have gone up to 109, 110, or 110. And nobody has synthesized 115 yet. It's incredibly difficult and is actually impossible for us. It can only occur in a natural state, and it only occur in a solar system that had a different beginning with much, much larger planets and suns in it. That's where they got the 115. But what they do with the 115 is it comes in the little reactor that's in the middle of the floor on these saucers is about the size of half of a basketball. It's a half sphere. And you take this half sphere off, and inside there's a little container. It's about 4 inches tall. And inside that container, which has a cap, inside the container is an arrowhead-shaped piece of 115. It's about 3/32 of an inch wide, about 2 inches long. And what they do is they pump protons into the 115 to bump it up to 116. Now it's been theorized that there is an island of stability as you go higher in the element scale, and in fact that's true. But what happens is it drops off immediately when you get to 116. 116 is unstable. 115 is stable. So what happens is when they plug protons into the 115, it bumps it up to 116, and it creates an instantaneous decay or transmutation back to 115. And what it throws off is antimatter, and it allows access to the gravity A wave. Now, we've talked about the gravity A wave before. The antimatter, what they do with that is they mix it with matter and to create a 100% conversion of matter to energy. And what happens is the energy is goes through a process, goes through a thermionic generator, which creates high voltage. And that voltage is, or positive voltage, and that voltage is used to run the craft. So this little tiny piece of arrowhead that's kind of orangish in color, I actually held it myself, can power the saucer for about 30, 35 or 40 years. And I think it only weighs about 233 grams.
You held element 115 in your hand?
Yeah, Bob had 3 arrowhead-shaped pieces of 115. 2 were stolen back by the government, and then there's another one that is out there somewhere, no comment.
Oh, that's incredible. How did Bob ever get those out?
That's a secret, too.
Okay.
But what we did is we took the 115 to prove its properties. And what we did is we put it in a glass bell jar, a huge bell jar. It was about 18 inches tall. And we put some dry ice in there to create the fog. And on the dry ice, we put the 115. And then from the top of the inside of the bell jar, we hung a piece of radioactive material. It was actually thorium, which used to power Coleman lanterns. And this emits the alpha rays, alpha particles. And the alpha particles are supposed to go out at tremendous speeds straight into space. But if we could see through the fog that the dry ice made, that the particles, the alpha particles, were drawn or pulled or absorbed by the 115, which proves its attractiveness or gravitational properties. And there's a videotape of it to prove that, but somehow it's disappeared. Now, Bob had a copy and George Knapp had a copy, and of course, we can't trust Bob to keep anything or remember anything, but certainly we thought we could trust George Knapp. But about a few months ago, it came up on one of the one of the threads that I was working that they wanted to see this video, and we asked George. Several people asked him if he could go and look for the videotape that proved what element 15 could do, and he couldn't find it. So, at least for now, that proof is lost.
Let me say hello to a few folks in the chat room. I'd like to thank After Dark Radio, Alien Talk Radio, Critifer. We've got, 15 guests in with the auto-generated numbers. I am Mick1212, Fante, Shaken, Spin Day, Spirit Guides Unite. Thanks, everyone, for coming to the show. I got a question from Spirit Guides Unite, and it deals with Mark Richards and the Secret Space Program. And I think you're not buying some of the stuff that Joanne Richards is saying. Is that true, John?
I don't recognize the name. What is she saying?
Oh, she's I've heard her on the show several times. Her husband is supposedly in our Secret Space Program, and has done a lot of amazing things, supposedly, in that whole aspect, and says that we have very advanced technology, and that we've been actually interacting with several extraterrestrial races, and she has a whole DVD series on it, and we've talked about it at length. And do you know anything about that at all?
Yeah, we certainly do have a secret space program, and we certainly do interact with different types of aliens, different species.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment myself. And I had one question that kind of scrolled off there. Someone was asking about element 115, which you pretty much described in detail. Let me get back on track here. Okay, the gravity A wave of heavier elements is more intense than the gravity A wave of the smaller numbers on the periodic table. Isn't that correct? The elements that have the smaller numbers on the periodic table have a weaker gravity A wave. Is that correct?
Correct.
And as the atomic number increases, the element becomes less and less stable. Is that correct?
Up until the island of stability, which occurs about after 112, 113. They become more stable until 15 is maximum stability, and then it drops off again. At 116 is unstable. That's why when they pump the protons into 115, it becomes 116. It instantly decays, and that's what throws off the antimatter and access to the gravity A wave.
The other part of this story that I think is really interesting is where Bob, he would be taken into a room and allowed to read briefings about extraterrestrials and extraterrestrial technologies. And the ETs that Bob talked about, I believe, were supposed to be from Reticulum 4, which is the fourth planet around the second star of the Zeta Reticulum system. And I think these beings were basically what we would call grays. And they said that they had photographic information about the Earth that was supposed to be 10,000 years old. But I think in 1979 there was some kind of conflict where the contacts came to an end. Do you know anything about that, John?
Yeah, first of all, the Earth is at least 24 billion years old. And the universe is not 17 billion like they feed us, or whatever, 17 billion light years. It's infinite. It's hard for the average person to to wrap their brain around something being infinite, but in fact the universe is infinite. As far as the now, what was the second question on the Greys?
Well, they were supposedly, they brought us photographic.
Oh yeah, there was a altercation, and there was an altercation at a secret base called Dulce. Dulce is an underground base in near. It's kind of about 70 or 80 miles north of Los Alamos. It's an underground base. It has, I think, 8 or 9 levels. Very, very highly secretive. They do the United States, or our secret government, does experiments and all kinds of research with aliens at this base. And in 1979, there was a conflict. Now, many call it a war. Some people even call it the Dulce Wars. But what it was that one Gray was giving a class to 44 of our top scientists. And during the class, a Delta Force security guard guy walked in. Now, they knew they were not supposed to get anywhere near a Gray with a weapon, with a conventional weapon. And they were told that if they did, that they would be killed. But for somehow, either accidentally or whatever it was, this guard walked into this classroom, and the Gray immediately killed him. And the autopsy read head wounds, so I can't enlighten you as to exactly what he used. But the Delta Force security saw on the security cameras, what had happened, and they went down to retaliate. And the Gray not only killed the retaliation force, but all the scientists. So I think there were 66 people killed, including the Delta Force security guards and the scientists. And the document that Bob read said that that didn't happen at Dulce, that it happened at Groom Lake. But at that time, I don't think his clearance was high enough to let him know about Dulce. So that's why the discrepancy could be there. But they told him, or it was written in the records, that they left and they would return at a certain time, which was a six-digit figure. But he said he didn't know what the digits represented. And so he couldn't tell us what time they were allegedly going to come back. But the fact is they never left. The Greys are here in a capacity as workers. And what they do is they take care of the containers. We are the containers. And they see that we grow normally. And they pick us up once at 3 years old, once at 7 years old, and once at 13 years old. And I'm not talking about special people. I'm talking about everybody on the face of the earth is abducted. Once at 3, once at 7, once 13 years old. And then as necessary, as they get older, there may be updated mods that they need or something else. But they are doing that on a 24/7 basis. And you look around, you figure there's 7 billion people here. How could they do all that? Well, if you could flick a switch that showed how many craft were actually in the air at any time during the day or night around Earth, the sky would be black. There's so many. Jeez. But in fact, no, they didn't leave. They're still here. They will always be here. They were here gazillions of years before we were, and they'll be here gazillions of years after humanity, after there's no requirement for humanity.
One of the things that Bob read when he was at S4 was a book that stated that mankind was the product of externally corrected evolution. And the book stated that man as a species had been genetically altered 65 times. John, does that sound correct to you?
It could be, but in fact, man is just they refer to us in containers, which is correct, and we're the containers of souls, and the reason we're put on Earth is for our souls to mature, and by mature, what I mean is we're supposed to learn how to live with integrity and without envy, without hate, and without greed. And that's all we're here to do. And when we die, We get a lecture and a recap of our life and how we've done, and the good things we've done, and the bad things we've done. And if we haven't learned to live with integrity and without envy, hate, or greed, we get set back here for another lifetime. But if we do make the grade and we do graduate, then we get to go out in the universe and play with the adults. We can go to different planets and do all kinds of neat stuff. But before we do that, we have to learn how to live with integrity and without envy, hate, or greed.
That's interesting that the grays, they call us containers. Do you think then that according to this material that Bob was reading, that we are the product of the genetic experimentation or the genetic scientific work of these grays?
I don't think, the grays probably do actually make us. We refer to ourselves as meat sacks. It's just a body that the soul is put into to mature, and it's of no use other than to hold the soul. And when we come back, if we have to do another lifetime, they do another body. But the externally directed, it sounds like it could be right, but I don't want to confuse you about what the actual purpose of the human is for. It's for the soul to learn these lessons.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to some of our earlier conversations about the way a lot of these extraterrestrials can leave their body just like we would change our clothes, correct?
Right. They can leave their body, and when you get really advanced, you turn into you can turn into a ball of light, and you can travel instantaneously across the universe anywhere you want to go. But that's at a really advanced stage, and it takes a while to get there. Get to that stage of development.
And we're kind of quarantined on this planet until we can learn to live without envy, hate, and greed, correct?
Individually, we're quarantined, yes. We cannot leave this planet. All the stuff you hear about the Apollo going to the moon, it's all BS. It's not true. We never went there. We can't go there. The aliens put the radiation Van Allen belt around the Earth specifically to keep us here and to not let us go, to try to get to other planets to spread our kind of democracy like we did in Iraq. They don't want any of that nonsense. So they put the Van Allen belt so that we can't go anywhere. But the persons that run this whole thing, they wanted the human population to think that we can do anything we want. So they faked the whole Apollo program. And there's an interesting thing on the website. If you type in Kubrick's Odyssey, it has exactly how Stanley Kubrick faked the moon landings for NASA. He was employed by him in 1964 to fake the entire program. And Kubrick's Odyssey goes into the methods that they used. They used the backscreen lighting with the Scotch-Brite tape, or a Scotch-Brite screen, and different things. It's extremely interesting. It's about an hour and a half, and it tells how he did it. And then it goes on to his last movie. I'm trying to think what it was The Kicker. There was a movie about him up in the mountain, or a movie about a guy that went to the mountains with the guy was played by Jack Nicholson. I'm trying to think of what that movie was. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
What was it? What was the name of that movie?
It was the spoof on the Apollo thing, and there was the one room. He was Jack Nicholson was taking care of this motel, and there was this one room where they couldn't go in. And Anyway, that movie was his last movie, his second to last movie, to expose
what he did. It was a confession to say, I
Yeah.
did this for NASA, and here's how I did it.
Yeah, I actually had Jay Widener on the show to talk about that.
Oh, he did? Ooh, I
Yeah,
wish
yeah,
I had listened to that.
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
What'd you think of Widener?
Oh, he's a great guy. He's an intelligent guy. Very, very perceptive. Very impressive. I thought that was
I was completely blown away with that Widener Kubrick's Odyssey. It was fantastic.
Well, talking about this allows us to shift gears a little bit because we're talking about the moon landing hoax, and the other thing that I wanted to at least start on tonight was the whole 9/11 thing, and one of the interesting things about 9/11 is that Bin Laden's most wanted poster does not even mention anything about 9/11 because the FBI has even admitted that they don't have any hard evidence that Bin Laden was involved in 9/11. And
Bin Laden had nothing to do with it.
That's interesting. Can you elaborate on that at all?
Yeah, this whole 9/11 thing was we are a war-based planet, and we are temporarily under the control of some aliens that are not too nice, and they like war, and they love to promote it. And we, the persons that run things, elected to go the war path in return for really super secret weapons, which they used on 9/11, and they've used in other places. And their modus operandi, all they wanted was the weapons, and they didn't care what they had to give up to do it. And that's why we're in the situation we are today. But in order to make this thing go, they had to keep a war going. So we went through World War I, World War II. Then we went into Korea. Then the Vietnam War started. Then we had the Israeli, and then we had the Grenada. And we were running out of enemies, so we had to pick an enemy that there was lots of, and that we wouldn't run out of. And so we decided to pick on the Muslims, the Arab Muslims. And so we picked on them because we'll never run out of Muslims to fight. And we concocted this whole scenario of 9/11 that these 19 Arab hijackers came and hijacked these airplanes and ran them into the buildings. And Rumsfeld and all those other charlatans said that the Muslims were bad guys and they hate our freedoms and all kinds of stuff like that, which is not true. This whole thing was planned from the inside, and I don't know who exactly did it, except for the fact that George Bush had nothing to do with it. He wasn't smart enough. They used him as a patsy, just like they used Oswald as a patsy in the Kennedy assassination. But this whole thing about airplanes flying into the Twin Towers is nonsense. You couldn't do it. Even the height of my proficiency, I could have not hit a 208-foot wide target going at 565 miles an hour, or 465, whatever it was, not even counting the fact that the Boeing 767 could not go that fast. Its limited speed is 0.86 Mach, or at sea level it's 360 knots. And you could add a couple of knots. You could add 40 knots to that for test purposes, but not any more than that. And so the speed that they said that these controlled Arab-flown airliners went was about 120 knots faster than the airplane is physically capable of doing. And then of course, we all know Building 7 fell for no reason at all, and the reason was Flight 93 that the public thinks crashed at Shanksville was supposed to crash into Building 7, but the video fakery that they were going to use, that they did use on Buildings 1 and Buildings 2, apparently went out or malfunctioned, and they could not fake the 93 crash into Building 7. So what they did is they hastily prepared that little trench there in Shanksville, and they put a few spare auto parts in there and parked a backhoe there, and had a couple of people standing around in hazmat suits. And 6 hours later, which was 5:20 p.m. in the afternoon, they finally let the press in and said, there's where Flight 93 crashed. And, of course, it's all baloney. Flight 93 didn't crash. None of them crashed. Where the airplanes are, I do not know. Where the passengers are, I do not know. I do know that half of the passengers were fake. They had no driver's license, no Social Security numbers, no IDs. They did not exist. I don't know what happened to those. The Pentagon impact was a fake. There was no Boeing 757 crashing into the Pentagon. April Gallup, who was a Army intelligence specialist, her desk was 40 feet from the hole that the explosives made in the wall, and she said she didn't see any airplane, no missile, smelt no fuel. All she smelt was kind of C4 type explosives, which they used to blow that hole in. So the whole thing was a big fraud.
Wow. One of the things that you said really kind of piqued my interest there, that, with all the experience that you have had flying, and anyone that's listening to the show, you got to realize that John has flown over 100 different types of aircraft, correct?
Say again?
You've flown over 100 different kinds of aircraft, correct?
Yeah, way over 100.
Yeah, I mean, you've actually been certified on 100, right?
Yeah.
And that's an incredible accomplishment. And John is saying that he could not have hit that tower even at the height of his proficiency. Could you explain that a little bit, John? Because I don't think the average person listening really understands that. I mean, I don't even fully appreciate how difficult it was to hit those towers with the plane flying that quickly.
Well, first of all, you're going 10 miles a minute, and it's going so fast that it's hard to pick out a tower unless you had flown over the area for years to pick the World Trade Center out from, they were allegedly at 30,000 feet, and to be able to line up at 15 miles out and then to keep that airplane directly headed towards a 208-foot target is just ridiculous. It can't happen. You're going too fast. There's too many things going on. Now, if I had a couple of tries at it, I could set up landmarks like at 1 mile out, 2 miles out, 3 miles out that I could use to line up. But the first time out of the box, no way. Nobody could do that, and nobody has been able to do that. Many of my friends have tried that in simulators with different airplanes and with the 767 and tried to hit those towers. And they can do it after 4 or 5 attempts, but they certainly can't do it after the first attempt. And to expect a novice pilot who has minimum time to jump in a 767, which has a completely different type panel than you would find in a in a Cessna 172 or a Piper Apache or anything like that, for him to be able to sit down and be able to navigate that 90 miles is just insanely ridiculous. It cannot happen.
John, I want to throw in, I flew a Cessna 150 for a while, and I absolutely, not in my wildest dreams, could sit in a passenger jetliner and fly it whatsoever. It's completely 10 levels above a Cessna, right?
Right. And but that's a story they're trying to sell the public, and believe me, there is a lot of people who believe that story.
And you were saying that the passenger plane can only have a max speed of 360 knots at sea level.
Right. That's its VMO. That's its velocity max operating.
And to go any faster, the plane starts to fall apart, correct?
Absolutely. It starts vibrating, starts fluttering, starts falling apart. And at 5 knots over 360 knots, you start getting the clacker. And the clacker is an overspeed warning. And it's a loud clacking noise that's designed to interrupt your thinking so that all you can do is pull those throttles back. It interferes with your brain so that you don't exceed it. You have to pull the throttles immediately back so you can start, doing things to correct that overspeed in the airplane. It's not something that could come on at 24,000 feet and beyond for the 6 or 7 minutes. It's going to take you to line up and hit the World Trade Center. It can't happen. It's ridiculous.
So the story that we've been kind of fed from the perspective of almost any experienced pilot is kind of patently ridiculous, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's I'm glad you brought those points up because, I've never flown at 360 knots, so I don't really realize, or 400 knots or 500 knots, I don't really realize how fast that is.
It's pretty fast.
And you're driving
especially when you're only 800 feet above the ground.
Yeah, that's a whole nother story, which makes me want to go back to Flight 77, which hit the Pentagon. Now, there were never any bodies of any passengers found there, correct?
No bodies. I've talked to friends in the Pentagon that were assigned into those areas after the crash, and they say, we're not supposed to say, but there were no bodies, there was no airplane, there were no airplane parts in there.
And a plane like
There's a lot of good people in this country, but we're all kept in line by that infamous little paycheck, which we have to get, and also we don't want to be suicided with 4 bullets in the back of our heads for saying stuff that they don't want said. So we're going to march to the company line.
And this plane had 2 gigantic titanium engines, which were never really found. Really nothing was found there, correct?
No, those engines operate at 900 degrees centigrate, and the fire didn't get any more than 615 degrees centigrade, which is what NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, says that's the maximum the fire got. So what happened to the engines? What happened to the rest of the airplane? I can't find any part that's been found.
I have a couple callers on the line. This first one may not even really want to talk. They might just be listening. I just want to say hello. 831, are you just listening, or did you want to ask John a question?
Blessings. I'm just listening, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for putting out this information. It's very insightful, and I really appreciate what you're doing this evening. And
well, thank you.
Thank you. A namaste to both of you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Just want to say hello. And 804, which I think is Hugh. Hugh, how are you tonight?
I'm terrific, Mark. You have to call me. You have my phone number there, right?
Okay, I do. Yes, I do.
Yeah, this is very important. I was on a show earlier, and I'm sure John might be familiar with the Paradigm Research Group.
Yeah.
Yes, I was just talking with Steve Bassett. The president has something on his website related to disclosure. We're going to kick it up big time. And I'm wondering if you could just comment on what you were saying before related to the souls and maybe touching on Jesus and spirituality. What's the bottom line and everything?
Jesus, God, the Bible, everything is it didn't happen. It was all a hoax. Yes, there is a higher order, but all of that stuff is not true.
That's a pretty big statement, John. Hugh, I put you back on hold there. I hope you don't mind. I want to continue a little bit here on this story of 9/11, and I want to play. I have another interesting clip here about Flight 77, which I think is interesting. I'd like to get your comment on.
Absolutely.
begins a complicated 330-degree turn, dropping 7,000 feet and exposing himself for an additional 3 minutes while executing a maneuver described by experienced pilots as nearly impossible, requiring professional expertise. In essence, an amateur pilot, considered a waste of resources by instructors, who was unable to control a small Cessna in August 2001, executed this nearly impossible maneuver in a 757 with skilled precision a month later.
Todd Lewis is working radar at Dulles Airport.
One of my colleagues saw a target moving from the northwest to the southeast.
And it was just a countdown, 10 miles west.
And she notified the supervisor.
9 miles west.
But nobody knew that was a commercial flight at the time. Nobody knew that was American 77.
What did you think? It was a military flight of some kind?
I thought it was a military flight. I thought.
And John, what I wanted to ask you about was this complicated descending corkscrew turn of nearly 330 degrees, and they were able to bring this huge plane in right above the ground and crash it right into the side of the Pentagon. And I know that had to be an almost impossible kind of maneuver. Is that correct?
It was not impossible, but it's precision. They turned 270 degrees and 8,000 feet. And if you look at the diagram, and I've read the digital flight recorder myself when it came out, there's 156 parameters, and they get a hit 8 times a second. So I can take any parameter, where the ailerons are, where the altitude is, where the airspeed is, and whoever was flying that was a pretty good pilot. But in fact, what they did was overfly the Pentagon. They didn't crash into it.
Do you think you could have done that maneuver at your peak as a pilot?
If I had a couple tries, but not the first time.
Not the first time, right? That makes sense. And you say they flew right over.
Yeah, they did an overfly. And whoever made the digital flight recorder, they didn't understand how flight recorders worked, because there's 3 altimeter readouts, and the one for the digital flight recorder reads on barometric pressure of 299 inches of mercury, and they didn't know that. So whereas the actual barometric setting at the Pentagon was 3022 inches of mercury, there's 370 feet. They were 370 feet higher than the digital flight recorder says, because it was just telling what the barometric setting was at what they call the normal setting. But as pilots, you reset that altimeter constantly for the varying barometric pressure settings of the various areas until you get above 18,000 feet. And then you go to standard barometric setting, which is 2992. Now, the reason they use that on the digital flight recorder is because they didn't have to change the setting on the digital flight recorder ever. They just had to leave it setting at 2992, and then if there was a crash, all they did was take the barometric setting of the airport at the time of the crash and subtract or add it, and they know what the actual altitude of the airplane was.
So, in layman's terms, John, are you saying that they monkeyed around with the black box, the digital flight recorder? Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't think they did. I think they just, other than cutting it off at the exact time that it was supposed to hit the Pentagon, I think they left everything there just because they were so stupid. And one of the things they did is when you're coming in, when you start your descent from altitude, when you get to 18,000 feet, you go from the normal setting of 292 inches of mercury to the local barometric setting, which in the case of the Pentagon at Reagan International was 3022. So when I was reading the digital flight recorder readout at 18,000 feet, the co-pilot's altimeter was set to 3022, and then 30 seconds later, the pilot reset his altimeter to 3022. Now that's very interesting because there was no co-pilot. It was just Hani Hanjour flying by himself. So we have to assume that if he said it, that he had to undo his seatbelt, climb over the throttle quadrant, set the altimeter setting, and then climb back, and then 30 seconds later set his. But the question is, even if he did that, where did he get the barometric pressure setting? He wasn't talking to anybody. He wasn't talking to Reagan Tower. He wasn't talking to center. Where did he get that 3022 that he set on the altimeter? All we know now is that a professional was flying that airplane. Or it was flying the airplane with that digital flight recorder in it. They weren't too bright, the guys who pulled this off, and I'm assuming that Chick Burlingame was up to his ears in this. I'm certain that he's alive these days. He was not killed in Flight 77, and he was Dick Cheney's gopher, and I'm sure that he had a lot of input on this, and he was a Navy pilot. And so that's about all I can say about his flight experience.
And what was that guy's name again?
Chick Burlingame.
And was he one of the quote unquote pilots?
He was
that was killed.
He was the supposedly killed. Yeah, he was the American Airlines pilot that was killed. And then just a few years ago, his daughter was murdered in her apartment in New York under very suspicious circumstances, and I suspect that he tried to make contact with her, and they found out about it, and either they killed them both or just killed her. But all we know is that she was murdered.
Gosh, that's such a sad story. We've got some really, really bad guys in charge here.
No kidding.
Depressing. We've got 8 minutes left. I think we could probably cover one or two more questions. There were 2 bags that were checked into Portland Airport that were supposed to be Muhammad Atta's. And one of the things that was found in Atta's bag was a will. And why would someone take their will on a plane that was going to be destroyed?
I don't know. How could a passport be found 3 or 4 blocks away from a crash in the World Trade Center where it was blown to smithereens, and then the passport is the only piece of paper that makes it out?
Yeah, very good question. And here's a clip that talks about some of the hijackers supposedly trained at U.S. military bases. Let me play this clip, and then I can see if I can get your comment on this. I think I still got, hopefully, right.
Reportedly trained at U.S. military bases. As hard as this is to believe that 2 of the alleged terrorists involved in what happened on Tuesday may have attended schools run by the U.S. military. Now, this is according to a senior defense official.
Ahmed Al-Nami, Ahmed Al-Ghamdi, and Saeed Al-Ghamdi listed their address on both driver's licenses and car registrations as the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida. Muhammad Atta reportedly graduated from the U.S. International Office School at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. In response to a Freedom of Information Act, Captain Jason Taylor confirmed that a Muhammad Atta trained there between 1998 and 1999, but did not verify if it was the same person.
So, John, do you think there is some relationship between the hijackers and U.S. military bases?
I'm sure there is, but if we're getting our information from a senior defense official, I'm not certain how much credibility we should give that information.
I hear what you're saying. Well, John, we've got about 6 minutes left, and I wanted to tell everybody again that we're speaking with John Lear. You can see a lot of his stuff at thelivingmoon.com, and we've been talking about the Bob Lazar UFO case, and we started a little bit on 9/11. And John, I wondered if you had anything that you wanted to kind of close out the show with, and share with our listeners this evening?
Yeah, first I want to say be sure and go over to Godlike Productions. It's a conspiracy website, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, there's a lot of sense of humor, and a lot of good information comes there. Most of the major networks go in there to find out what's really going on. Whether they publish or not is not sure, but they certainly know about it. But what I wanted to say is, for the people who are really distressed about the way the world is going and the things that we don't like, and the murders and the starving in Africa and the killings in Iraq and all that stuff going on, you really don't have to worry about that, because it's beyond your control. It's out of your control. The only thing you can control is yourself and your family. And the best thing for you to do, instead of worrying about all that stuff, is to live your life with integrity and without envy, hate, or greed, and to express your love to your family each and every day. And that doesn't mean a love you, honey, as you bang the door on your way out. It means to take your wife and your kids and put your arms around them and tell them how much you love them, because that's what's the most important thing, and that's what you should be doing. Don't worry about all that other stuff, because you have no control over it.
Well, John, thanks for another great show. It's always fun talking to you, and you have a good evening, sir.
Okay, call me anytime.
All right, thanks, John. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.